My name is Helen Carter. I'm 72 years old, and if there's one truth life carved into me, it's that love given without limits often comes back empty. I cared for everyone: my husband when his body failed, my son Michael when he was helpless, my grandson Noah when he needed warmth. I believed family was something sacred, unbreakable. Until one evening, Michael looked at me across the table, his tone calm and detached. "Mom," he said, "you should move into the cabin up in the mountains." The sunlight had begun to spill through the blinds, painting long golden lines across the floor. The pancakes were still on the counter, now cold, their scent fading. I put them in a tin and set them aside. Maybe I'd eat them later, maybe not. That evening, I cooked dinner beef stew with vegetables, the same recipe I'd used for decades. It had always been Michael's favorite, especially during the long winters when the heater broke and we had to eat wrapped in blankets. It was a sterile way to describe a woman they'd once left alone in a cabin with nothing but cold air and old memories. I folded the letter neatly and set it aside. There was no anger left in me, only clarity. That night, after the bakery closed, I walked through the empty shop, turning off the lights one by one. The shelves still smelled faintly of butter and cinnamon, and I could hear April humming in the back room, tidying up before she left. When she stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron, she noticed the letter on the counter. "From him?" she asked. I nodded. "Are you going to answer?" "Yes," I said softly, "but not with a letter." The next morning, I went to the small courthouse in town. The clerk recognized me. Everyone did these days. She smiled, offering a polite nod as I signed the papers I had prepared with the local attorney the week before. It wasn't a will of bitterness. It was a declaration of truth. When I finished, I held the document in my hands for a long moment. The ink was still drying, the words calm and final. "I, Helen Carter, leave no financial or material inheritance to any family members who have abandoned, exploited, or neglected me after the age of 62. All future profits from Helen's Hearth Bakery will be donated to the Women's Renewal Foundation, a program dedicated to helping women over 50 learn new trades, rebuild their lives, and rediscover their worth." I signed my name at the bottom in steady cursive, Helen M. Carter. My hand didn't tremble once. When I stepped outside, the morning light broke through the clouds, washing the street in gold. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of rain and bread baking somewhere down the block. For the first time in my life, my story belonged entirely to me. Michael came a few days later. I had asked him to meet me at the bakery one last time. When he walked in, his face looked thinner, drawn. He seemed to have aged years since I last saw him. The weight of regret had a way of showing itself on a man's face. "Mom," he said carefully, like he was approaching something fragile. "Sit down, Michael," I said. He did. The shop was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. "I suppose you got my letter," he said. I did. "And well." "And?" Instead of answering, I reached behind the counter and placed a folder on the table between us. Inside was a copy of the notarized document. He opened it, scanning the words. As he read, his jaw tightened, his lips parting slightly. When he reached the last line, he looked up, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "You're disinheriting me?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm simply leaving what I built to the people who need it." He pushed the papers back toward me. "You can't be serious. This isn't you." "Oh, it's exactly me," I said. "The me you never bothered to know." His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. "You're punishing me." I looked at him steadily. "No, Michael, you punished me. You just never noticed." He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand gently. "Do you remember the day you drove me to the mountains? You said the air would be good for me. You told me to call if I needed anything. I never called, Michael, because I realized I didn't need you. What I needed was my own life." He looked away, his throat tightening. "I thought leaving you there was helping," he muttered. "I thought you wanted peace." "I wanted peace," I said softly, "but not abandonment. There's a difference." He exhaled shakily. "You don't understand what was happening then. We were drowning money, work, everything. Laura, this isn't about excuses," I interrupted gently. "It's about what happens when love becomes convenience." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and sharp. Finally, he whispered, "So that's it? You've written me out of your life?" "No," I said. "I've written myself back into mine." He looked at me for a long time, his eyes glassy. Then, in a voice almost breaking, he said, "I came here hoping for forgiveness." "You already have it," I said quietly. He blinked. It was a dish made of memory, of warmth, of love that didn't ask for thanks. I spent hours cutting, stirring, seasoning. By the time it was ready, the sky had turned lavender outside. "Dinner's ready," I called out. Laura came into the kitchen first, still typing something on her phone. Her hair was perfectly tied, her perfume faint but sharp, like citrus and ice. She sat down, took one small bite, and frowned. "Mom, you shouldn't use this much salt. We're eating cleaner now." "Then why?" "Because forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing," I said. "I can forgive you without giving you the power to hurt me again." Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. "You're really never coming back, are you?" I smiled faintly. "Michael, I was never the one who left." He looked down, his shoulders shaking once. Then, without another word, he stood and walked toward the door. Before stepping outside, he turned back. "You know," he said softly, "you were always stronger than I gave you credit for." I met his eyes. "I always was. You just weren't looking." The bell above the door chimed as he left. This time the sound didn't hurt. It felt like the final note of a song that had gone on too long. That night, after closing the shop, I stayed behind alone. The shelves were empty, the ovens cooling, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound left. I brewed myself a cup of ginger tea and walked outside onto the sidewalk. The sky was deep blue, the moon caught between the branches of the maple tree across the street. The cool air smelled of sugar and wood smoke. I sat on the bench outside the bakery, the same bench where customers often waited for their morning bread. For a moment, I thought of everything that had led me here. The laughter that once filled my kitchen, the silence that followed, the mountains, the first pie I baked alone, the first customer who called me Miss Helen. Each memory carried its own weight, but together they no longer hurt. They simply were. April joined me a few minutes later, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "So?" she asked softly. "Was it hard?" "No," I said. "It was honest." She nodded, sitting beside me. "You know, what you're doing, it's going to change people's lives. The women you'll help, the ones who'll get to start over because of this place." I smiled faintly. Maybe that's the point. Maybe life doesn't end with what we lose. Maybe it begins when we finally stop waiting to be found. The wind shifted, brushing my face like a blessing. I thought of Michael again, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a kind of distant compassion. Maybe one day he'd understand that I hadn't destroyed our bond. I'd simply stopped holding all the pieces alone. For the first time in decades, I felt light. I looked through the bakery window. The sign above the counter, Helen's Hearth, reflected softly in the glass. Beneath it hung a small note April had written for me the day we opened. "You are never too old to start again." I traced the words with my gaze and whispered, "True." And Vortigam. Then I took a sip of tea, feeling its warmth spread through me, steady and certain. For 72 years, I had been a daughter, a wife, a mother, a caretaker, a shadow. But as the night deepened and the stars bloomed over the town, I realized I had become something far simpler and far greater. Myself. And that was enough. If you've listened this far, maybe something in my story sounds familiar to you. Maybe you've been the one who gave too much, who stayed too long, who loved without being seen. Maybe you've waited for someone to remember you the way you once remembered them. I used to believe love was about sacrifice, that the more I gave, the more it proved my worth. But life, it seems, had to teach me the hard way that love given without respect only empties you. The truth is, no one can take from you what you no longer offer freely. When I finally stopped waiting to be needed, I learned how to breathe again. When I stopped begging for space in someone else's story, I began writing my own. I think of that old cabin sometimes, how the silence there once felt like punishment. Now I see it differently. It wasn't isolation, it was transformation. The mountains didn't take me away from the world. They returned me to myself. If you're listening to this, sitting alone somewhere, thinking it's too late to start again, it's not. You can rebuild at any age. You can plant something new in the ashes of what was taken from you. Even after decades of being invisible, you can wake up one morning and decide that your story isn't over yet. Healing doesn't always come with applause or forgiveness. You know, less sodium, less fat. I looked at her, then at the bowl in her hands. It's the same way I've always made it. She smiled tightly. Exactly. Michael came in next, still wearing his work shirt, tie loose, phone in hand. He didn't even look at the table. "Smells good," he said absently, already scrolling through his messages. I waited for him to sit, to look at me, to say something kind. He didn't. Sometimes, it comes quietly in the warmth of your own hands, in the sound of your own laughter, in the peace of knowing that survival itself is a form of victory. I used to think revenge was about making others hurt. Now I know the greatest revenge is simply becoming someone they can never hurt again. So, if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a life that no longer fits you, remember this. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to begin again, even if you have to do it alone. Because sometimes, being alone is not the same as being lonely. Sometimes, it's the beginning of coming home. And if my story touched something inside you, then stay with me a little longer. There are more stories like this, stories of loss, forgiveness, and quiet power waiting to remind you that you are not forgotten and you are never too old to rise again. When I poured him water, he mumbled, "Thanks, Mom," eyes never leaving the screen. Noah joined us last, earbuds still in. He didn't even remove them. He shoveled food into his mouth while watching a video on his iPad. I stared at them for a long moment, the family I had given everything to. They were all there, yet I had never felt more alone. After dinner, Laura gathered the plates and passed them to me. She didn't say thank you. Michael walked straight to the living room, turning on the TV. Laughter erupted as some sitcom started. I stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes in cold water. The water heater had been broken for weeks. I had told Michael twice. He'd nodded both times, saying, "I'll get to it." He never did. The water was icy, biting at my skin. My fingers ached as I scrubbed each dish. The window above the sink reflected the dim kitchen light, and for a second, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. I remembered the first year Michael went to college. I had worked part-time at a small bookstore, saving every spare dollar for his tuition. He never knew. I didn't tell him because I didn't want him to feel guilty. I wanted him to study freely, to chase dreams that were once mine. When I was 25, I was offered a job at the county library, a permanent position, steady pay, surrounded by books and quiet. I had planned to take it, but then my husband got sick. I folded the offer letter, tucked it in a drawer, and never looked at it again. I told myself that love meant sacrifice. That family came first, always. But sitting there, my hands red from cold water, my heart empty as the sink, I began to wonder if I had confused love with erasure. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands, and sat down at the kitchen table. A cup of chamomile tea sat in front of Michael's empty chair untouched. I had made it for him earlier to help him sleep. It was cold now, lifeless. I wrapped my hands around it anyway, as if I could warm it again with my palms. The television from the next room roared with laughter. Someone shouted, "That's hilarious." I could hear Laura's giggle, Noah's quick laugh. Their joy didn't hurt me, it just didn't reach me anymore. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The house smelled of stew and soap and faint loneliness. I remembered when that same scent used to mean safety, belonging. Now it only reminded me of how much I'd given up. I thought about my husband, about the day he died. Michael had been there, standing at the foot of the hospital bed, trying to be strong. I had held his hand and whispered, "Take care of your father's dream." He had nodded through tears. I didn't realize then that somewhere along the way he had stopped including me in that dream. The years passed quietly after that. I cooked, cleaned, helped raise Noah, and never complained. It wasn't that I was afraid to speak, it was that I didn't know how to anymore. Silence had become my second language. When I opened my eyes, the clock read 10:30. I hadn't moved in nearly an hour. We need our own space now. That single sentence ended everything I once believed in. That morning began like every other, quiet, gray, and heavy with the smell of yesterday's coffee. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked faintly through the stillness. It was barely 6. I had stopped setting alarms years ago. My body simply knew when to wake up. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was loneliness. Either way, I found comfort in being awake before the world stirred. The house was still alive with voices from the living room, but I no longer felt part of them. I looked down at my hands again. The skin was thin, lined, familiar. These hands had built everything in this home. The meals, the comfort, the warmth, and yet they were treated like tools. I thought about what love had cost me. Every choice I made, every dream I buried, Every word I swallowed had carved me into this quiet, obedient shape. But that night, something cracked. It wasn't anger, not yet. More like realization, soft but undeniable. As I stood to turn off the kitchen light, I caught my reflection once more in the window. The woman looking back at me wasn't just tired. She was gone. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped serving, stopped waiting, stopped begging to be seen. What if I simply chose myself, even once? The thought scared me. But underneath the fear, something else stirred, something small and stubborn, like the first flicker of a match in a dark room. It wasn't hope. It was memory. The memory of who I used to be before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's afterthought. I turned off the lights, leaving the kitchen in shadow. The faint hum of the refrigerator followed me down the hallway, like the steady breath of a house that didn't need me anymore. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel crushed by that silence. I felt awake inside it. And though I didn't know it then, that quiet moment, the weight of cold tea, the smell of stew fading in the air was the beginning of the end of my old life. Because from that night on, something in me had shifted forever. It happened on a Saturday that smelled like rain and sugar. Noah's 15th birthday. I had been up since dawn, my body moving before my mind had time to catch up. Birthdays had always been sacred to me. They were the days when family gathered, when laughter filled the air, when I could still believe I mattered. So I wanted this one to be perfect. Maybe if I made it special, he'd remember that once he loved my cooking more than anything in the world. I tied my hair back, rolled up my sleeves, and began. The kitchen came alive. The sizzle of butter on the pan, the clatter of bowls, the faint melody of the wind outside. I baked his favorite apple pie, the same recipe his grandfather used to love. The smell of cinnamon and brown sugar filled the whole house, soft and comforting. Laura had told me earlier in the week, "We're going with a Hampton-style backyard party this year. Clean, minimal, white and gold theme." She had handed me a list, a long one, full of orders. Finger sandwiches, fruit platters, cupcakes, lemonade jars, all labeled neatly. She didn't ask if I could manage. She just assumed I would. So I did. I cooked until my back ached and my hands went numb from washing dishes. By mid-afternoon, the backyard looked like something from a magazine. White tents, long wooden tables, and strings of gold balloons spelling Noah. I went upstairs to change before the guests arrived. I put on a cream sweater, the one Michael had bought me for Christmas years ago, before everything between us grew so quiet. In the drawer of my nightstand, I saw the brown envelope I'd kept hidden, a savings account with everything I had, nearly $200,000. It was the money my late husband and I had built, little by little, through years of thrift and sacrifice. I had planned to give it to Noah today, as a gift of legacy, something passed from one generation to the next. I thought it might remind him that love isn't loud. It's steady, quiet, and made of 1,000 small sacrifices. When I stepped into the backyard, the party was already in full swing. Children ran across the grass with balloons. Adults mingled with drinks in hand. The sound of laughter and pop music filled the air. I stood at the edge for a moment, holding the warm apple pie, smiling faintly. For a brief second, I let myself feel proud. I walked toward the table, ready to set the pie down. But before I could, a boy pointed at me and asked loudly, "Who's that lady?" Noah turned, his face blank, his tone casual. "Oh, her? That's just the housekeeper. She helps around here sometimes." The world went silent. The laughter, the chatter, the music, all of it faded into a low hum in my ears. I stood there frozen, the pie trembling slightly in my hands. My heart felt like glass, fragile and sharp. The children laughed. A few parents smiled awkwardly. I slipped on my old cardigan, the one with a frayed cuff and a missing button, and shuffled into the kitchen. The tiles were cold under my bare feet. A draft came through the window, rattling the blinds just enough to remind me that autumn had arrived. I turned on the light. The warm glow fell across the counters, illuminating the small stack of plates I had washed the night before. They were spotless, lined neatly, waiting for another day that would look just like the last. Someone muttered, "Well, she's doing a great job." Laura walked past me, adjusting the tablecloths, pretending not to have heard. Her silence hurt more than any word could have. Michael was standing near the grill, talking to a coworker. Our eyes met for half a second. I waited for him to say something to correct his son, to stop this humiliation. He didn't. He looked away. I stood there holding the pie, the smell of apples and sugar swirling around me, suddenly nauseating. My arms ached. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. When Laura finally turned toward me, her voice was polite but sharp. "Mom, if you're feeling tired, maybe go inside for a bit, okay? We've got everything handled here." Handled, as if I were a burden that needed managing. I nodded, forcing my lips into a weak smile. Of course. But as I turned away, my hands gave out. The pie slipped from my grasp, falling onto the patio stones with a dull, wet thud. The crust cracked, and warm fillings spilled across the ground, steam rising like a ghost of everything I'd tried to hold together. For a moment, no one moved. Then a few people chuckled awkwardly, whispering to one another. Noah didn't look at me. Laura didn't bend down to help. And Michael, my son, the boy I once sang to sleep, finally stepped forward, but not to comfort me. He said quietly, "Mom, please just go inside. You're making a scene." Something inside me broke cleanly then, not with tears, but with silence. I turned and walked toward the house, my steps steady, my hands trembling. Inside, the noise from the party grew faint, like the echo of another life. I went upstairs to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. The air smelled faintly of apples and smoke. My eyes landed on the brown envelope still lying in the drawer. I pulled it out, opened it slowly. Inside was the life I'd saved every hour of labor, every coin of love that no one had noticed. I had planned to hand it to Noah after the party, maybe with a hug and a few words about his grandfather. Now I knew I wouldn't. I folded the paper again, carefully, and locked it away. Then I whispered to the empty room, "That's enough." I didn't cry. I didn't shout. The pain was too deep for noise. That night, after the guests left, I heard Michael's knock on my door. It was soft but deliberate. "Mom, can I come in?" I opened the door. His face was unreadable, half guilt, half exhaustion. "I think," he began slowly, "it might be best if you spent some time at the cabin for a while. You know, the one up in the mountains? The air up there's clean, peaceful. It'd be good for you." I stared at him, my mind blank. "You mean, move there?" He nodded. "Just for a while. Things are busy here. Noah's in high school. Laura's taking on new clients. And the house feels crowded. You'll be comfortable there, Mom. Really." I looked at him. Really looked at him. The boy who once clung to my hand at every thunderstorm was now a man who couldn't look me in the eye. My throat felt dry. "All right," I said quietly. He looked relieved, almost grateful, as if I'd made things easy for him. "I'll have someone drive you next week. We'll send groceries, of course. And if you need anything, just call." I nodded again. Of course. When he left, I sat back down on the bed. The house had gone still. Downstairs, I could hear faint laughter, Laura's voice, Noah's. Life was continuing, effortlessly, without me. I reached for my suitcase under the bed and brushed the dust off the handle. It had been years since I'd used it. I opened it and began folding clothes, not because I was ready to leave, but because it was the only thing I could control. On the nightstand, the lamp cast a soft glow over the brown envelope. I touched it gently, tracing the edges. I would take it with me not to give away, but to start over. As I packed, I thought about how love can die without ever being buried, how it can keep walking around a house, cooking, cleaning, smiling, even after everyone has stopped seeing it. I zipped the suitcase and closed it with a click. That sound was small, but final. The next morning, I woke before dawn again. The kitchen smelled of last night's leftovers. I brewed one final pot of coffee for the house, poured a cup, and sat by the window. The light was dim, gray with early morning mist. Outside, the garden looked peaceful, untouched by what had happened. Dew glistened on the grass. Balloons from the party still floated gently under the tree, deflated and tangled in branches. I realized then that I had spent my whole life tending to people who never looked back to see who was tending them. Cooking had always been my language of love. It was how I told people, "I'm still here. I still care." So I started, like always, by making breakfast. I whisked eggs in a bowl, added a little milk, a pinch of salt, and set the skillet to heat. I had decided to make blueberry pancakes, the kind my grandson, Noah, used to beg for when he was little. He used to sit on the counter, legs swinging, watching the bubbles rise on the surface of the batter. And though I didn't say it out loud, I made a quiet promise to myself. When I left that house, I wouldn't just be leaving a home. I'd be leaving behind a version of myself that no longer existed. The caretaker, the servant, the shadow. By the time the truck came a week later to take me and my boxes up the mountain, no one stood at the door to say goodbye. Laura was working. Noah had a soccer game. Michael simply patted my shoulder and said, "Take care, Mom. We'll visit soon." I smiled. Of course you will. But I knew he wouldn't. As the truck rolled away, the city faded behind me, the streets, the houses, the life I had built piece by piece. Ahead lay the mountain road, narrow and quiet, lined with pines and fog. For the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid. I just felt done. And though I didn't yet know it, that drive toward the cabin wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The road to the mountains curved like an old scar, familiar, lonely, and endless. The air grew thinner the higher we climbed, pine trees rising on either side like quiet sentinels. The driver, a young man Michael had hired, kept his eyes on the road and spoke only once to ask if I was warm enough. I nodded, clutching my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. The rest of the trip passed in silence, the kind that stretches so far it begins to feel like company. After 2 hours, we reached the turnoff, a narrow dirt road leading up to a small wooden cabin that sat like a memory between the trees. I had been here before, years ago, when my husband and I used to come up for weekends. Back then, it was our refuge from the world. Now it was my exile. The driver helped unload the boxes, one suitcase, a crate of kitchenware, a stack of old books, and a single wicker basket filled with homemade bread and jam I'd packed myself. When everything was inside, he lingered awkwardly at the door. "You sure you'll be all right out here, ma'am?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "I've been all right in worse places." He nodded, unsure what to say, then climbed back into the truck. The sound of the engine faded down the dirt road until there was nothing but the whisper of wind and the rustle of pine needles. I stood there for a long while, staring at the cabin. The wood was weathered but solid, the small porch sagging slightly at one corner. I could smell damp earth and cedar, mixed with something sweet, the faint scent of wildflowers growing nearby. Inside, dust coated every surface like a thin layer of time. The furniture was just as I remembered. The old oak table, 2 mismatched chairs, the wood-burning stove still sitting stubbornly in the corner. A cracked porcelain teacup rested on the windowsill, a ghost of a different life. I rolled up my sleeves and started cleaning. There was comfort in the rhythm of it. Wipe, sweep, breathe. Each stroke of the rag felt like reclaiming a small piece of space. The air inside slowly shifted from musty to fresh. By the time I finished, the afternoon light was spilling through the window, soft and golden. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window. Outside, the forest swayed gently, branches whispering against one another. The silence was so deep it had a texture, like wool pressing softly against the skin. For the first time in years, no one called my name. No one needed me. It was terrifying and liberating. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. I lit a fire in the stove, the crackling wood filling the small room with warmth and the faint smell of smoke. I wrapped myself in a quilt that still smelled faintly of lavender from years ago. The bed creaked beneath me, but it felt like a kind of peace. Before sleeping, I opened the drawer beside the bed. The brown envelope was still there, sealed and untouched. I traced my finger along its edge, then closed the drawer. Not tonight, I thought. Not yet. In the morning, I woke to birdsong, soft, hesitant, as if the forest was still deciding whether to trust me. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting long stripes across the wooden floor. I brewed tea, sliced an apple, and stood by the window eating slowly. It had been years since a morning belonged entirely to me. After breakfast, I walked outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall trees and patches of wild grass. I found the old path that led to the stream and followed it, the ground soft under my shoes. The sound of running water grew louder until I reached the edge of the creek. The water was cold and clear. "They look like tiny moons, Grandma," he'd giggle, and I'd flip them just in time to make him laugh. Now the only sound was the hiss of butter hitting the pan. I set the table carefully, placing each plate with precision, as if my attention to detail could make them see me again. The smell of warm batter and maple syrup filled the room, wrapping it in sweetness and memory. Footsteps came down the stairs fast, uneven. I crouched, dipped my hands in, and felt the sting of the cold cut through the numbness that had settled inside me for years. I watched the ripples spread, slow and deliberate, as if the mountain itself was breathing. When I returned to the cabin, I felt lighter, like I'd shed something invisible but heavy. Days passed quietly. I swept the porch, repaired a broken shelf, planted a few herbs by the window. The work was simple, grounding. I began to mark time by small things. How the light moved across the walls, how the wind changed direction in the afternoons, how the scent of pine deepened before rain. In the evenings, I sat by the fire with a book in my lap. Sometimes I read, sometimes I didn't. The silence no longer scared me. One night, as I was flipping through an old notebook, I found a page that made me pause. It was from years ago, a sketch of a bakery. My bakery. Helen's Hearth. I had drawn it when Michael was still a child, back when dreams still felt possible. I used to imagine a little shop on Main Street with warm bread, soft music, and the smell of cinnamon in the air. A place where people came not just to eat, but to feel safe. I stared at the drawing for a long time, tracing the lines of the tiny window and the handwritten sign above the door. It looked childish, hopeful, and heartbreakingly alive. The next morning, I cleaned off the old wooden counter near the stove and decided to bake again. Not for anyone else, just for me. I found a bag of flour in one of the boxes, a few eggs, a jar of sugar. The motions came back easily, like muscle memory. The smell of butter melting filled the air, wrapping around me like an embrace. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it. The rhythm, the patience, the quiet joy of creation. The first apple pie I baked that day was a little burnt around the edges, but when I took a bite, it tasted like something long lost and finally found. I laughed out loud, alone in that cabin. The sound startled me. It had been so long since I'd heard my own laughter. Later that week, I decided to go into the small town below the mountain to buy more ingredients. It was a modest place, one gas station, a diner, a grocery store that smelled faintly of soap and cinnamon. At the counter, a young woman greeted me with a bright smile. She couldn't have been more than 30. Her name tag read April. "Morning. Haven't seen you around before," she said cheerfully. "You new up here?" I nodded. "Sort of. Moved into the old cabin by Pine Hollow." Her eyes lit up. "Oh, that's a beautiful spot. Kind of isolated though, huh?" I smiled faintly. "Isolation isn't so bad when you've been crowded out of your own life." She tilted her head, curious but kind. "That sounds like a story. Maybe someday I'll tell it," I said. When I paid for my groceries, she noticed the bag of flour and sugar. "You bake?" "A little," I replied. She grinned. "If you ever feel like sharing, I run a small organic shop in town. We sell homemade goods. Could use someone who knows her way around real butter and cinnamon." I laughed softly. "I'm not sure anyone would buy what I make. And, trust me," she said, handing me my change. "If it smells like home, people will always want it." I left the store smiling, a feeling I hadn't known in years. Back at the cabin, I unpacked my groceries and wrote a note in my notebook. Try baking for others again just to see how it feels. That evening, I baked a batch of cinnamon cookies, wrapped them in brown paper, and placed them by the window to cool. The smell filled the small cabin, sweet and comforting. I brewed tea and sat outside on the porch, watching the sky fade from gold to violet. The forest hummed softly with life. I could hear the creek below, the flutter of wings overhead. Somewhere deep in the trees, a fox cried out, sharp and brief. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of the mug between my hands. For the first time since leaving that house, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt reclaimed. As night settled in, I realized something simple but profound. Peace doesn't come from being needed. It comes from finally needing yourself. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and baked sugar. I thought of Michael, of Laura, of Noah, and for the first time, their absence didn't ache. I wasn't angry. Not yet, but I was awake. And in that awakening, something was quietly reborn. Noah appeared, tall now, shoulders hunched beneath his hoodie, earphones plugged in, his phone lighting up his face. He didn't even look up. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, smiling. "I made your favorite." He glanced at the plate, frowned. "Grandma, I told you, I don't eat that anymore. I'm trying to stay fit." He grabbed a protein bar from the counter and unscrewed the lid on a bottle of cold water. "Oh," I said softly. The days in the mountains began to blend together, soft mornings of mist and quiet, long afternoons filled with the smell of coffee and pine, and nights where the stars looked close enough to touch. The world below had its noise and chaos, but up here, time felt slower, more forgiving. I had fallen into a rhythm, waking at sunrise, opening the windows to let in the cold air, baking something small, cleaning the garden, writing a few notes in my old notebook before dusk. Every task was its own kind of prayer, a way to remember that I still existed. But the loneliness crept in sometimes, quietly. It didn't roar, it whispered. It came in the middle of dinner when I caught myself setting an extra plate out of habit. It came in the evenings when the radio went silent, and all that remained was the crackle of the fire and my own heartbeat. One afternoon, while I was kneading dough, I thought of April, the bright-eyed girl from the grocery store with a voice like sunlight. Her invitation echoed in my head. If it smells like home, people will always want it. The next morning, I decided to test that theory. I woke early, the air crisp enough to sting. The sky outside was pale blue with streaks of silver clouds. I baked 3 kinds of pastries: cinnamon rolls, apple turnovers, and oatmeal cookies dusted with nutmeg. When I finished, I wrapped each batch in brown paper and tied it with twine. The smell filled the cabin warm, buttery, alive. I loaded everything into a basket and began the walk down the winding road toward town. It was a long walk, nearly 2 miles, but I didn't mind. The mountain air was cool, the birds sang somewhere far above, and every step felt like a small act of rebellion against the woman. I used to be the woman who never left the kitchen unless she was called. By the time I reached April's shop, my legs ached, but my heart was light. The little store sat between a barber shop and a thrift store. A wooden sign above the door read Earth and Hearth in soft, faded paint. Inside, shelves of honey jars, candles, and small baskets of fruit lined the walls. April looked up from the counter, her eyes widening. "You came," she said, her smile breaking into something that felt genuine, like joy. "I hope I'm not intruding," I said softly, holding out the basket. She waved me off. "Intruding? Please, what's that smell? Oh my God." She lifted one of the wrapped bundles, untied the string, and inhaled deeply. "Is this cinnamon?" "Cinnamon and brown sugar," I said. "Old recipe." She took a bite and closed her eyes, sighing. This tastes like my grandmother's kitchen." I laughed, a sound I didn't recognize at first. "Then I suppose I've done something right." "And A.T." She grabbed my hand impulsively. "You have to let me sell these. I'm serious. I've been looking for local bakers, and yours, this. It's not just food, it's comfort. People need that more than ever." I hesitated. "April, I don't even know how to start something like that." Her grin widened. "That's where I come in. I'll handle the online stuff. Photos, listings, orders. You just bake. We'll call it..." She paused, thinking. "What's your name again?" "Helen." "Then we'll call it Helen's Hearth. Simple, warm, feels like a hug." The words hung in the air like a spark catching fire. Helen's Hearth. My old dream, resurrected by someone half my age who believed I still had something to offer. I wanted to say no. I wanted to retreat back into the safety of silence. But something inside me whispered, "Say yes." And I did. By the following week, April had brought a few things up to the cabin: a small mobile Wi-Fi device, a camera, packaging supplies, and a notebook labeled orders. She was full of energy, her voice dancing through the cabin like wind chimes. "Okay," she said, setting up her laptop. "We'll start small. A few listings, nice photos, short descriptions. I'll take care of marketing. You just keep baking exactly like this." I watched her move around, typing, photographing, laughing. She reminded me of myself when I was young, before years of service dulled the shine. When she was done, she turned the screen toward me. "Look," she said. There it was, my apple pie, my cinnamon rolls, my cookies all displayed under the name Helen's Hearth. Beneath the photo, April had written, "Handmade in the heart of the mountains. Baked with memory, care, and a touch of warmth." I felt tears sting my eyes. "You make it sound beautiful," I whispered. "It is beautiful," she said simply. That first week, we sold 4 orders. April clapped like a child when the first notification came through. "You've got customers, Helen," she shouted. "Well, maybe later then?" He shrugged, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Yeah, maybe," but I knew he wouldn't. When I reached to hand him his backpack, he stopped me. "Grandma, it's fine. I've got it." His tone was polite, almost rehearsed, like someone repeating lines from a play he didn't care to be in. We drove to school in silence. He scrolled through his phone the whole way, I watched him out of the corner of my eye, the same profile I once kissed goodnight, now sharper, distant. Each sale felt like a heartbeat. I wrapped the pastries carefully, writing each recipient's name by hand. For the first time in years, my handwriting mattered. My time mattered. By the second month, the orders had doubled. A local cafe started buying pies every Friday. April handled the emails, the deliveries, the payments. I focused on baking, letting my hands remember what it felt like to create joy. The cabin smelled constantly of vanilla and cinnamon. Some nights, I fell asleep with flour still on my hands, the warmth of the oven fading behind me like a lullaby. People began leaving reviews. One of them read, "The pie tastes like someone who remembers you when you've forgotten yourself." I printed that line and taped it to the wall above the stove. I started smiling without realizing it. April began visiting more often. We'd sit on the porch with mugs of tea, watching the sunset bleed across the mountains. She'd tell me about her childhood, about leaving a corporate job in the city because it made her feel hollow. I'd listen, nodding, feeling pieces of myself echo in her words. One evening she said, "You know, Helen, you could open a real shop someday. People down in town already ask where they can taste your pies." I shook my head, laughing. "I'm 72, April. Shops are for people who are starting their lives, not closing them." She smiled gently. "Or for people finally living them." Her words lingered long after she left that night. Later, I sat by the window, the stars sharp against the dark sky, and opened the brown envelope again. The money was still there, untouched, patient. I traced the edges of the paper, thinking of all the years I had saved it for others, never for myself. Maybe, I thought, it was time. 2 weeks later, April drove up with a map and a proposal. "I found a space," she said, spreading the papers across the table. "It's small but cozy, right next to the bookstore in town. Rent's cheap. Sunlight hits the window all morning. I think it's waiting for you." I looked at the numbers. They were reasonable, manageable. Still, my stomach twisted with fear. "April, what if it fails? What if nobody comes?" She leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "Then at least it's your failure, not someone else's choice for you. Don't you want that?" I did. More than anything, I did. So I took a deep breath, pulled the envelope from my drawer, and placed it on the table between us. "Let's do it," I said. The following months were a blur of sawdust, paint, and possibility. We scrubbed the floors, repainted the walls, and built wooden shelves. April designed a small sign for the window, Helen's Hearth Bakery, with the same handwriting from my old sketch. When the day of the opening arrived, I didn't invite anyone. There were no banners, no speeches. Just a handwritten note on the door. Open. Warm pies, hot tea, a place to rest. By noon, a few curious faces peeked in. Then more. One woman bought a slice of pie, took a bite, and started to cry. "It tastes like my mother's kitchen," she whispered. That afternoon, we sold out. As I stood behind the counter, watching people smile and talk and linger over their tea, I felt something bloom quietly in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pride. It was belonging. April hugged me before she left that night. "You did this," she said softly. "You brought warmth back into the world." End of fight. When I closed the shop and stepped outside, the streetlights flickered on, bathing the storefront in soft gold. I looked up at the sign, Helen's Hearth, and for the first time in my life, I saw my own name attached to something that was entirely mine. The wind carried the faint scent of cinnamon into the cool night air. Somewhere, in a house far away, my son was probably sitting in front of a screen, my grandson scrolling on his phone, my daughter-in-law planning her next perfect party. But I didn't think of them with bitterness. Not tonight. Because tonight, I was more than a mother, more than a caretaker, more than a ghost. I was Helen Carter Baker, survivor, and finally, the author of her own story. And in the quiet hum of the town, under the gentle glow of my shop window, I could almost hear my old life fading away like dough rising in the oven. Slowly, beautifully, becoming something new. 10 years passed. When we pulled up to the curb, I instinctively unbuckled my seatbelt. "I'll walk you to the door," I said. He turned sharply. "Grandma, please don't. My friends are right there." I froze, my hand on the door handle. "I just wanted to make sure. Just stay in the car, okay? They'll think you're like the maid or something." He said it casually, without thinking, but it hit me like a slap. I nodded, forcing a smile that felt like it cracked at the edges. Of course, honey, I understand. The seasons came and went, and the town below the mountains grew around my little bakery like vines around an old tree. Helen's hearth was no longer a secret, it had become a place people sought out. Travelers stopped on their way through the valley. Neighbors came with stories and laughter, and every morning the smell of cinnamon drifted down the street like a gentle promise. April still worked beside me, her hair now streaked with faint threads of gold. She said we were partners, but I often thought of her as the daughter I never had. She handled the shop's emails, the suppliers, the new cafe orders. I baked, taught small classes on Saturdays, and talked to customers about the simple joy of kneading dough with patience and love. Life was quiet, full and whole in a way I hadn't believed possible. Until one autumn afternoon, when the doorbell above the bakery chimed and the past walked in. I was restocking the shelves with freshly baked loaves when April called from the front counter, her voice hesitant. "Helen, there's someone here asking for you." I turned, wiping flour from my hands. At first I didn't recognize him. He looked thinner, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes hollow like someone who had lived too long without rest. It was Michael. He stood in the doorway, uncertain, like a man entering a stranger's home. The smell of apple pie filled the air between us, soft and sweet, almost mocking in its warmth. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice strained. I didn't move. "Michael." He exhaled slowly, relief flickering across his face. "It's really you. I didn't even know where to start looking. I only heard about this place last month." I nodded toward the tables by the window. "You can sit if you'd like." And he glanced around the bakery, taking in the shelves of pastries, the soft jazz playing, the chalkboard menu written in April's neat handwriting. "You built all this?" "I did." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You always did know how to make something out of nothing." I didn't answer. I placed a pot of tea on the table, 2 cups. "Ginger tea," I said. "Still good for the heart." He smiled weakly, but his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. "It smells the same," he whispered. "Like home." I sat across from him. 10 years of distance sat between us, heavier than the air itself. I could see the lines around his mouth, the faint twitch in his jaw when he swallowed remnants of pride still clinging to a man who had lost too much. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't come here just to talk. I wish I could say I did, but—" He stopped, looking down at his hands. "Things haven't been easy. The business went under last year. We're behind on the mortgage. The bank's about to foreclose on the house. And your name's still on the deed." I stayed silent. "If you sign it over to me," he continued quickly, "I can save it. We can refinance, maybe start again. Laura's been sick. Noah's in college now, but—" "Stop." My voice cut through his words like a blade of ice. "Michael, look at me." He did. His eyes were bloodshot, desperate. "You left me in that cabin 10 years ago," I said quietly. "No visits, no letters, not one call. Did you think I'd just disappear like smoke?" He swallowed hard. I thought you wanted it. You said you'd be okay there." "I said I'd manage," I corrected, "because I didn't want to beg for a place in my own family." He looked away, guilt twisting his mouth. "Mom, please. I know I hurt you, but this is different. I'm asking for help. For my family." "Your family?" I repeated, my tone cold. "You mean the same family that watched me carry trays of food while your son called me the maid?" He flinched. His shoulders slumped. I stood and walked to the counter. From a small box, I took out an old key, rusted, worn smooth from years of use. I placed it on the table between us. "That's the key to the cabin," I said. "Everything you're looking for is there." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Go there," I said. "You'll understand." He opened his mouth to protest, but I had already turned away. My hands trembled, but not from weakness, from control. When he left, April found me standing at the sink, staring out the window. The trees outside were gold and red, trembling in the late afternoon breeze. "Was that him?" she asked softly. I nodded. "What did he want?" "The same thing he always did," I said. "Something that wasn't his to take." Any fives. He got out and walked away without looking back. I sat there, watching him disappear into the sea of teenagers, laughing, bumping shoulders, free of guilt. I stayed parked for a long time. The radio played faintly some song from the 80s about holding on, but the words didn't reach me. I just sat there, staring ahead, hands clenched on the steering wheel, wondering how I had become invisible in the life I built with my own hands. When I got home, the house was quiet again. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fire in the stove burned low, casting flickering shadows across the floor. I thought about Michael driving up the mountain road, his headlights cutting through the dark like a confession. I imagined him stepping into that cabin, the same cabin he had left me in, untouched for a decade. He'd find the place exactly as I had kept it. Clean, quiet, timeless. On the nightstand, in the same drawer where I had once kept the envelope, there would be a note. Michael, I used the money to live, not to wait. The house may be gone, but I am not. Your mother, Helen. 2 days later, the bell above the bakery rang again. This time, Michael didn't look desperate. He looked broken. His eyes were red, his hands trembling. You left the account there, he said, his voice hoarse. You could have destroyed it. You could have hidden it. But you didn't. I didn't need to, I said. You needed to see what mattered more than money. He stared at me, confusion flickering behind his exhaustion. Mom, I don't understand. You're really just letting it go? No, I said quietly. I let you go a long time ago. He sank into the chair, running a hand through his hair. You talk like you're not my mother anymore. I met his eyes, steady and unblinking. I was your mother. But mothers aren't meant to be shadows. I raised you. I forgave you. But I won't live in the corners of your life anymore. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a metronome for everything unsaid. Finally, he whispered, Do you hate me? I shook my head. No, Michael. I stopped hating you when I stopped waiting for you to love me. He swallowed hard, his face pale. Then what do you want from me? Nothing, I said simply. For the first time in my life, absolutely nothing. He flinched, as if the words themselves struck him. He stood abruptly, his voice cracking. You think you're better than me now? Because you bake pies and people clap for you? No, I said calmly, because I finally learned to feed myself. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and stormed out. The bell above the door jingled once, sharp and final. I didn't follow him. April came out from the back, her face pale. Helen, are you okay? I smiled faintly. For the first time in 2 years, yes. That evening, after the shop closed, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. The town lights shimmered below, warm and distant. I could still feel the echo of Michael's voice in the air. Anger, regret, fear. But underneath it all, I felt something stronger. Peace. I had spent a lifetime serving, forgiving, and shrinking myself to fit the needs of others. But the woman who once begged to be seen was gone. In her place stood someone quiet, whole, and unafraid. I thought of the little cabin up in the mountains. I hoped Michael had stood in that same doorway where I once stood, breathing in the silence he'd left me with. Maybe he'd finally understood what it felt like to be unseen. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. I sipped my tea and smiled faintly. The taste was warm, soothing ginger and honey, steady and true. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of baked sugar and pine. The world kept moving, but for once, it moved with me, not around me. My revenge was never loud. It was not born of rage or vengeance. It was born of quiet survival. And in that stillness, I had built a life that no one could ever send me away from again. A week passed before I heard from Michael again. I thought perhaps he'd finally let the silence settle, but one morning, a letter arrived, stiff paper, typed neatly, the envelope marked from a law firm in the city. I sat at my kitchen table in the bakery's small apartment, tea steaming beside me, and read every word carefully. It wasn't an apology. It was a proposal. The letter requested that I reconsider my decision regarding the family property, and offered a compromise if I signed over my share of the house. They would guarantee financial support for my ongoing care during my advanced years. My ongoing care. The phrase made me laugh, not cruelly, just quietly.